the genesis of this book really was around about 2016. You know, when you had Manchester Arena happened, and then you had London Bridge, and you had Westminster Bridge, and then you had Brexit, and then you had Joe Cox being murdered. And then the following summer, a guy rammed a van into a mosque quite near where I live in North London. And I just got into a bit of a state, to be honest. I got quite low because I just kept thinking, I'm just hearing negativity on both sides. You know, I'm hearing these extremists on the right, and I'm hearing extremists on the Islamist side. And, you know, I've got 2 young kids, and I just felt like, well, given what I've got, my modest set of skills, you know, I'm not a politician, I'm not like an activist. What can I do to try and make anything better? And it felt like the world that I had grown up in and the family and the community that I'd grown up in wasn't the one that I saw the people who opposed Islam thinking. But then I also thought that the way that some Muslims depicted non-Muslims wasn't the world I understood either. So I just thought, well, why not just do everything you really, really were worried about asking about Muslims? Not like, let's not pussyfoot around. Like, what are the things people think, and are they legitimate? So to do that, you have to do misconceptions on both sides. So it didn't seem fair to only pick on one side. I kind of wanted to try and tell a more nuanced story. And to do that, you kind of have to look at the misconceptions and also to check whether they are misconceptions or whether there might be some truth in them as well.
So why are there so many preconceptions, stereotypes, beliefs on both sides of Muslims and non-Muslims about each other in Britain?
I think part of it is to do with the way that people arrived, mostly in the early 60s and late 50s, where they settled and how they grew up, you know? Because essentially, if you don't know people, if you don't mix with people, that is the recipe for misunderstanding and ignorance on both sides. I think that's basically it. You know, if you grow up in a community, I grew up in a community where we basically didn't really have anyone who was not Muslim or Pakistani come into our house. You're going to have all sorts of ideas about what those people are like. Similarly, if you're on the other side and you don't actually know any Muslims, but you just read, you know, what certain parts of the press say or what certain extremists do, you're going to have that. So for me, it's about a lack of interaction and a lack of meaningful experience of the other. And it's from those seeds that I think, you know, antipathy and misconceptions arise.
One of the things where you do come in and you acknowledge that you had your own preconceptions is round when you speak to women who wear the burqa.
Yeah.
What were those misconceptions or preconceptions that you came in with, and were they challenged?
Well, I basically, you know, my thinking is, if you go around wearing the niqab in Britain, firstly, don't think you're more Muslim than my mum or my sister or my sister-in-law who wear none of those things. So don't go around trying to think you're more religious than them. And secondly, you're not really doing your best to fit in, are you? It's almost like you're kind of making a statement that you're different. And I kind of find that a bit bizarre. Like, why would you actively highlight that? And so my sense was that there was a little bit of sort of try-hardness going on, like people trying to proclaim their religiosity a little bit. And so I came in it with all those kind of preconceptions. But the truth was, I actually didn't know anybody who wore a niqab. And when I started asking my friends, nobody seemed to know anybody out of my friends' social circle either. So I thought, well, I wonder what it would be like to actually talk to, you know, somebody who wears that. So I went and did some, you know, bit more work. And then I eventually met, you know, 4 or 5 women. I met more than 4, but at one particular time I sat and talked with 4 of them. And it was really interesting, because one of the things that was interesting was, you know, there's a sort of sense of anonymity, because you can't really tell very much about somebody when they can only see, you know, a little bit of them. And so I was just like, well, how am I going to tell who's who when I'm talking? And it was interesting how within a few minutes, personality started coming through and you could tell. So that was interesting. The second thing that was interesting about that was how this was a year before the pandemic. And then suddenly the idea of being masked up and the idea of not quite being able to tell fully people's ideas and what they were thinking because you couldn't see their expression, suddenly everyone else got used to that. And then the third thing I thought was, you know, it's interesting about who we choose to pay attention to. So the truth is, I do think the niqab's not that I don't think it's that helpful. But then I also think people going around, with multiple piercings and inadvisable tattoos is not that great. But we don't necessarily see the Prime Minister whittering on about that. So it's quite interesting who you choose to make a target of things. And the fact of the matter is, I'm not a big fan of the niqab, but really, who gives a monkeys whether I care about it or not? Yeah. It's such a small number of people that the amount of attention it gets is not actually in balance. The other thing that was really interesting is there was one of the women said to me, I'm only wearing the niqab. We were in the cafe. She said, I'm only wearing this because you're a Muslim. If you weren't a Muslim, I'd be wearing something else. I said, what do you mean? She goes, well, because I know you'd understand why I'm wearing and you'd respect that, that's why I'm wearing it. But if you were a white journalist, I probably wouldn't. And I thought people who wore the niqab just wore it all the time. But she was like, no, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. And again, that was for me a bit of an eye-opener.
And did you find any reasons in writing this why Muslim communities might not want to integrate with the rest of Britain?
Any community, particularly if it comes from another place and has its own practices, its own religion or its own beliefs, its own traditions, it worries that too much exposure to the outside world will dilute those things. And once they're diluted, they're gone forever. And so I think with the Muslim community, what they think is, what will happen to some of the things we hold dear? And the thing is, I'm saying this in a really abstract way for you, but there are real world consequences to this. For example, I say this in my book, my mum is in her mid-80s, and she lives at home with my older brother and his wife, and who looks after her. And the idea that she would, she's got vascular dementia, the idea that she would be put into a home or anything is just inconceivable. Okay, we have grown up in a culture, a Muslim Pakistani culture, that believes parents look after their children, and then after a certain age, the children look after their parents. Now, my kids are much, much less likely to do that for me. I don't think that's great. That's not something I particularly celebrate. That is an example of a dilution of traditions and culture that happens and is happening. And I think is one which I would particularly, I would mourn. So so there are things that you lose something. And if you feel like what you've got is valuable, you don't want to lose everything. So like for my mum, she's of that generation that would have fully expected to have, a Pakistani daughter-in-law who was going to live in the house with them and she could talk to and be another daughter, basically. So it's a bit of a shocker when that script isn't what happens, And I think there's another thing, which is just that there's a worry people have that in doing something so different, what you're doing is you're turning your back on the whole community and the whole family and everything. It's like, again, it's like attaching bigger things. So like, if you have done this, that means you no longer want or believe in any of us.
And there's one thing that sort of struck me a couple of times in the book is those that had better knowledge of the Quran and better knowledge of the religion and were almost more religious were often more tolerant. So can you explain some of the situations where that came out?
I mean, that was to be honest, that's a really good example of where my own stereotype came in, because I sort of started the book slightly worried that my conclusion would be, if only everybody could just be a bit more like me, things would be all hunky-dory, And that's not really how you want to end the book. It's not exactly a mission statement to kind of rouse and inspire a nation. But what was interesting is that, I'm sort of semi-observant, if you want to call it that. I don't drink and I don't eat meat that's not halal, but I'm not a prayer, and I'm not, I'm not particularly devout in any of those things. And I just thought you need to have that sort of level of religiosity to sort of be okay in society. But turns out that's mostly nonsense, because actually a lot of the people who were the most progressive, if you want to put it, in terms of what they were doing, knew more about the religion. So there's a teacher we mentioned up in Yorkshire who teaches students music as a really large part of the school curriculum. Now, there are parts of Luton where there'll be parents who will say that music is completely haram and it's against God, and it's completely wrong, and they won't allow their kids to even study music. But this teacher, because he was like proper Muslim and had actually read the Quran in Arabic, could go toe to toe with these people and actually tell them, you're talking nonsense. And because he knew the religion, he was able to get the parents on board. So that's an example of where if you actually know stuff rather than just what you think you might have heard from somebody, it becomes really useful. Marriage is another one. The religion says there's absolutely nothing wrong with, for example, Muslims, Christians and Jewish people marrying. There's just that's literally not an issue because they're all children of Abraham. Most people who have problems with the idea of marrying outside the faith, are either unaware of that or, sort of don't particularly pay attention to that part. Do you know what I mean? So that's an example of where if you actually know stuff about the religion, and I'm not claiming I know loads, but if you just know stuff, it can actually make you more hopeful that Britain's Muslim community can be firmly embedded in a positive way with everybody else. And that's something which I think is something which most people wouldn't necessarily assume.
And which things that you spoke to people about do you feel are most changing and most going to be different for a next generation?
I mean, I think marriage is changing. I think, the number of people now, the idea that you're going to marry your first cousin back in the village was just really, really common in my generation even, and is now just not going to happen. So I think that's changing. I think people are not, I think the situation in terms of young women growing up, I think the expectation and the assumptions of what they think they can do has changed a lot. I think representation's changed a lot. If you think about how, if somebody like myself was growing up and the things that I saw and what I thought one could aspire to in terms of the media, but also in terms of business or work and employment, it wasn't great. And just in that one generation now, I just think it's unimaginable to think that a kid today could basically imagine that they can do pretty much most things, and it not feel implausible. I mean, it kind of blows my mind that there are, the Chancellor, the Home Secretary and the Health Secretary are all British Asians and nobody even talks about that. I mean, they may all be appalling individuals, but the fact that they are British Asians is still kind of amazing. They're not all appalling individuals. I interviewed Sajid Javid for the book, and he's a nice guy. But the fact that nobody really talks about that, and that's just it's fine, and it's completely conceivable that the Chancellor could become Prime Minister. That's an incredible journey to have gone on in the last 20 years. And I think, one of the things I sort of do think about when I was writing the book is we don't actually sometimes pay attention to just how much things have changed for the better because we're so kind of anguished and only focusing on division as well. So I think representation is an incredible progress. The fact that we have a mayor right now who's a British Pakistani in this city, for example. So there's lots to feel hopeful for as well.
You're quite hopeful for the picture of the future. You wanted to give hope in this book. Who would you most like to pick it up? Well,
I mean, to be blunt about it, I actually wrote it for my children. So, my daughter's 9, she's going to be 10 in August, and my little boy's 4.5. And I basically wrote it because I was worried that they would feel happy and comfortable with their white, British, Scottish side, but basically think that their Muslim Pakistani side was a bit embarrassing and a bit of an annoyance and had nothing positive to say about it, And they are at that age at the moment where the idea of religion, the idea of Islamophobia, if you want to use that word, the idea that there is something problematic about Islam hasn't yet seeped into their mind. And what I wanted to do was to try and write something so that if and when they do start, it's going to be probably more when rather than if, they do start knowing about those ideas, they've got something that can help, vaccinate them, if you will, against some of those narratives and say, well, actually, that's not the whole story. And I wanted them to feel comfortable with both sides of their heritage. So they're really the inspiration for why I wrote the book. And I hope that when they read it, and if they read it, they feel it helps them feel comfortable with both sides of who they are.
Well, thanks so much. It's an incredibly interesting book to read, and thanks for chatting to me.
Great to talk to you.